Today we're going to talk about faith versus foolishness. I found that there's a fine line between faith and wishful thinking. A lot of people think or hope that something will happen, and they say it's faith, but in reality, there is no faith there.
Yeah, there's a difference between the two. Sometimes the line is fine. There's a story here in Scripture. The writer of Hebrews refers to the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea. In Hebrews 11:29, by faith the people crossed the Red Sea as if on dry land. But the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. It's real interesting that Moses and the Israelites, the action is the same. They started walking out across. The Egyptians saw what the Israelites did, copied the action, did the same thing, and they had fatal results.
Right.
And so knowing the difference between faith and foolishness is very, very critical, because if you think you're in faith, but you're actually in foolishness, it can actually be fatal.
Yeah.
The Egyptians died because they didn't have the underlying faith. They just had the action.
Right.
So how do we know the difference?
Well, that's a good question. And one of the things that you can hear when I talk to somebody and I hear, what, they really are in faith. You can tell by the way they're talking. They are fully convinced. They're just not hopeful. There is a confidence when they talk that this is going to come to pass. Whatever it is they're believing for, whether it's health, whether it's something that needs to happen with, legal things, or maybe finances, whatever it is. It's not just like, yeah, I believe God for this, but there's like, they talk about it, and then, you know what? We're having a bit of trouble right now, but my God is going to come through. And I just know that this is going to resolve this. I just have peace about it. I'm not worried about it. And when we look at James, it talks about, you can ask God for wisdom. But then he says something after that. And that's a principle that goes for anything you ask God for and believe for. And he says, and this is the Passion Translation in James 1, and let me jump into verse 6. If you ask about wisdom, this is the context. Just make sure you ask empowered by confident faith, without doubting that you will receive. For the ambivalent person believes 1 minute and doubts the next. Being undecided makes you become like the rough seas driven and tossed by the wind. You're up 1 minute and tossed down the next. When you are half-hearted and wavering, it leaves you unstable. Can you really expect to receive anything from the Lord when you are in that condition? When people are like believing one day, but you talk to them the next day and they're like, oh, the one day they're like, yeah, I'm believing God for this money. I'm believing God for rent money. And then the next day and you talk to them, how's it going? You're like, you know what? I'm just so concerned that maybe we have to get locked out of our apartment because we can't pay rent. That's not faith. They are believing one day and doubting the next day. That's not faith. You're wavering. You're just whatever you feel like that day. You feel high, so you believe God. You feel low, so you start doubting. That's not faith.
Faith is not an emotion.
Right.
Just like love is not an emotion.
Right.
There is human love, which may be an emotion. There is human faith, which may be an emotion. But Bible faith is not an emotion.
Right.
Bible love is not an emotion.
Right.
It comes out of the human heart. It's deeper seated than an emotion.
Right.
And here in the beginning of Hebrews 11, it says it like this, that faith is the assurance of things hoped for. How do you know you're born again? Being born again and knowing we're born again is not an emotion. It's something that is in our heart. It's much deeper than what the emotional aspect is. Real faith will affect emotions. Real love will affect emotion. The salvation experience with God will eventually affect emotions as well. But that's not the seat of it. That's not the origin of it. So if you're looking for an emotion, you will miss faith every single time. That's not what faith is. Faith here, it is a persuasion, it is an assurance of things hoped for, it is a conviction.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a knowing. And the knowing is not in the mind. The knowing is not an emotional kind of a knowing. It's a knowing in the heart. That's how we know we are born again. I remember early on in our ministry, we were out rural. We didn't have much money. In fact, the money had been finished. And it's one thing to believe God for something when you're not desperate. It's a little bit different when you're believing God for something and it's a sink or swim type of a situation.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm confident. I know in my heart God will provide. All kinds of doubts in the head, troubles in the head. That's okay. Faith in the heart will work with doubts in the head. You just have to make sure you don't get into a place of worry. But these thoughts, they will try to come. They always do when you're battling a faith battle. In fact, that's what a faith battle is: keeping your thought life straight and keeping the peace in your heart. And so I'm keeping peace in the heart, and it never failed. I mean, we've lived like this for quite a while, and food would always show up. Food would always show up, and we've never gone without paying our bills. We've never gone without um, food or anything like that. Actually, if you're going without paying your bills, that's not faith. That is assumption. It's foolishness. It's different labels you can put on that. But I remember we had just gone through this experience, and food just showed up. And then there was another ministry team that they were going out. They were doing very, very good work, crusade kind of work in remote areas, and they set out. And it was a 1 week trip. After 2 days, their money is running out, and then they start pulling funds out of their business, and the business goes bust as a result of pulling funds out of the business. They started out thinking it was faith, but it wasn't. Now, here Jesus in Luke 14, talking about the cost of discipleship, Jesus used an example, and it talks about when you set out to build a tower, do you not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? And especially I'm not so much talking about faith for healing, but talking faith for finances, faith to finish a project, faith to get goals moving or something like this. It's a process, and I find so many people that have not sat down to figure out, I need money. How much do you need? Well, I'm in debt. Well, I didn't ask you if you're in debt or not. I asked you how much you need. And it's so interesting that 90% of people that are coming, trying to live by faith, trying to believe God, they don't even know what they need.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something, David did not deny the existence of Goliath.
Mm-hmm.
He knew about Goliath. And so if you can't even properly identify the problem, you'll probably never conquer that problem.
Right. That is true. And so, I've seen one of the things we said is how do you identify faith? And it is through what you hear people say, how confident you are when you talk. But the other thing is the action you make. And again, you might try to imitate someone's action and think you're going to have the same results, but it may not work like that. And so, there's a difference between true faith and foolishness. And so I'm reminded of, for example, you say you believe God, and you go and take a loan and say, you know what, I just need money right now, so God's going to pay my loan, and then you never get that paid down.
Yeah, that never works.
That was not faith. That was you were hoping, but the action wasn't confident. But I was reminded about when we were getting into the facilities that we currently have, Rainbow Bible Training College in here in Nairobi. We didn't have office space or classroom space to even start the school. But we had announced for everybody that we were starting a school. And so people started, applying. We got a small shared office space and people could come and apply. And they were all asking, so where is the school going to be? And we didn't know. We didn't have anything, but we had this leading on the inside. And that's, when the God leads, you can be confident and walk on that. But you have to learn to hear God's voice. You gotta, that's something you need to start to train yourself to hearing. And so we had something in our heart we said is gonna be in Azure Tower. That's where we are right now. And at the time we just had a leading that we're gonna be there, but we hadn't found that place yet. But we had, walked with God. We know his voice. And we were confident. There's that confidence. We were confident it's going to be there. Well, it came down to just a few weeks before, and we still didn't have a place. And so we went looking in that building. And finally, we found a place that was the only place that was finished. Everything would take some months to prepare to even finish. And as we looked at the facilities, it wasn't quite what we were thinking, but we said, I think we can make this work. But you know what? We didn't have the money for it. And here's the thing. We kept believing God for money for the deposit to sign the contract, on the lease. We didn't sign the lease until we actually had the money. But we had to believe God that the money had to come in. And so, sure enough, the same week as school started, the money came, we signed a lease, and we had a place to have the school. But so many people, they just take a loan maybe or borrow money, and they just say, I'm believing God that I'm going to be able to pay it back, or I'm believing God for me needing all my needs, but yet they go charge that credit card again. They go take that loan again. And they never see God provision because they were not in faith doing it. They just didn't see another way around, so they just went and did something in the natural, hoping that something would work out.
Yeah, sometimes you'll end up in situations that it'll be a painful process of climbing out of the hole of debt. If you're going into debt thinking you're believing God, it is better to truly believe God and see Him come through and pay cash for a lot of these things. I think it's we've been down this path. We have done the hard work of climbing out. It was hard. We're thankful we did it. We had to cut a lot of expenses, cut a lot of costs to get that done. There's only been 2 cases in my life when I knew God said, put that on a credit card or put that on a loan. In both cases, they were supernaturally provided for. But in those cases, I knew God said, go ahead and do it this way. In fact, I didn't even want to do it that way.
Right.
Because I know it's not wisdom. Right. It is foolishness.
Right.
But when there is a true conviction in the heart,
right.
then you will go split the Red Sea. Yeah. You will step out and walk on the water. You will do things that are impossible, but you have to make sure that there is a conviction in the heart, and you have to make sure that that conviction is so strong that you will still be convinced of what God has said. Faith is based on a promise. You still have to be convinced of what God has said. When the opposition comes, you can't be emotionally swayed. You can't be swayed in mind. You can't get to the place where you start grabbing hold of these doubts, because then you'll be out of faith and you'll lose in the middle of the battle, and you'll sink in the middle of the ocean if you do that. Right. But if you know, I'm so well convinced, I don't care if a wave comes. I don't care if Goliath shows up. I don't care if the witch doctor shows up, whatever the case might be. I know that the one who is in me is stronger and more powerful. I know what his promise is. I know the covenant I have with God. Nothing can stop that promise. When you are convinced of that, that's real faith, and you can step out and you can walk on the water.
Right. And another thing is that you got to start where you're at. Because I have talked to people that believe God's going to provide for them a house. That just someday God will give me a house. Well, someday doesn't come like that. If you truly believe God for a house, before you believe God for a house, you will have to believe God for bus fare. You will have to believe God for new clothes. You will have to believe God to provide for the current needs that you have at the level you're at. You will have to believe God for rent money. If you are currently in a situation where you can't pay rent every month and you can't believe God for provision to pay rent every month, God is never going to just give you a house out of nowhere. It doesn't work like that. You haven't built your faith to the level where you can receive a whole house if you haven't first proven God faithful to provide the needs to pay rent where you're at today. So you got to take this step by step and build your faith and grow your faith and learn to prove God faithful in your life so that you can look back and say, God provided for me when I needed rent money. God provided for me when I needed money for food. God provided for me when I needed transportation money. God will also provide for me when I'm going to college maybe, or when I'm going to build my house, wherever it is. God will provide for me because I have built my faith. I've seen his faithfulness. And as continue to believe God for bigger and bigger things, you have grown your faith for those things.
Yeah, we have a friend. Just some months back, somebody actually gave him a house.
Yeah.
Just completely gave him, fully paid, and all this.
Yes.
Approximately $1 million house. He didn't start out there.
No.
Multiple cars have been given to him, and all kinds of stories of provision.
Right.
It's interesting in Luke chapter 2, it says that Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at Jesus, he actually didn't start out walking on the water.
Right.
He started out stilling the storm.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't start out raising Lazarus from the dead, who had been in the grave for 4 days. He started out with Jairus' daughter and the funeral procession, raising people from the dead when the death was very recent. When you've been in the grave for 4 days, it's a different situation. So even Jesus started out relatively small, and he grew from there. That's how faith works. It's very similar to going to the gym. If you've never been to the gym, you're not going to start out lifting 200-pound or 100-kilo weights.
Right.
You're going to start at the level where you are.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is with the faith walk as well. You have to start where you are.
Mm-hmm.
Even in business, you have to start where you are. Nobody climbs a ladder starting at the top rung or even the middle rung.
Mm-hmm.
You start at the rung where you are, and you keep going from there. And that's the way the faith walk is as well.
Right. So, instead of just hoping God's going to come through on big things, start exercising your faith in those areas that you currently have to deal with. Don't just look ahead at someday, hopefully something will happen and boom, there's going to be something big. No, you start working and exercising the faith at the level you're at. You learn, you prove God's faithfulness in your life. You stand on the scriptures for what you need today. And from there, you will build that faith muscle. I call it a faith muscle. Like you build it stronger and stronger the more you work it. The more you exercise it, the more it becomes stronger. And the more stronger it grows, you will also believe God for bigger and bigger things. One of the major things that people do is they look at people who have been working their faith muscle for 20 years and they compare themselves to them and they say, if they can do it, I can do it. Well, you don't know what they've been through. You don't know what kind of faith battles they had to go through and sustain in order to get where they are today. And if you don't do the same things, you won't have the same results. And so people need to realize that you can compare yourself to their chapter 20. You have to write your own book and you have to start at chapter 1 just like they started at chapter 1 maybe 20, 30 years ago. But the thing is that they started at some point and they have worked it up to where they are today. But where have you started? Have you started at all? And if you haven't started at all, it is time to start today so that you can start writing chapter 1 of your faith book, chapter 2, and build upon that so that when you get to also chapter 20 where they are today, you might be able to believe for the same things and exercise faith in the same area as they are today.
Yeah, nothing is impossible for the one who believes. All things are possible for those who believe. And mountains can be cast out by speaking. Mark 11:23 talks about this. But there is something here that you can't place your faith in a man of God.
Right.
And you can't place your faith in somebody's example of walking by faith. In Mark 11:22, Jesus said, have faith in God. Faith can only be placed in God and in the promise that he has made you, not in the promise he made somebody else. You have to know God for yourself.
Mhm.
And you have to start there, not copying somebody else's actions or trying to copy their faith, but you have to develop your own faith with God. It's a personal matter. That's where you start. And you don't get into foolishness, but you make sure that the things that you're convinced of, that you're truly, truly convinced of it, and you know, it says here in the word, I know because God has spoken to me.
Mhm.
That's where real faith starts. And you do that where you are, and you keep going, and you keep growing, and faith, your life will go from faith to faith. And it's a wonderful life to live.
Yes. So, just check out to make sure you're not in foolishness. You're not in wishful thinking. You are actually in faith. And if you've never done it, today is a good day to start and just start exercising your faith where you are today. And you will see a year from now, 5 years from now, your life will be changed. And so we know that a life of faith is exciting. And we know that you will build that and work that faith muscle out as you work it every single day of your life. God bless you so much.